Please welcome Dr. Malcolm C. Harris, Professor of Finance at Friends University.
I guess the first Republican president said you can fool some of the people some of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. I think the modern corollary to that, well, why don't I ask if they hear? Can you hear me?
I hear you good enough? All right.
Yeah. Thanks for looking after my interest, John, but I tend to tail off if I don't have to work at saying what I'm saying. I was a lector in our old parish when I lived in Connecticut, and there was something in that parish I thought was fabulous. The organist, who was way in the back of the church, had the controls over the loudspeaker system. So if one of the soft-speaking lectors got up, he could turn up the volume. If I got up, he turned it off. But I found if I get too dependent on a microphone, I get lazy. So please wave if I start tailing off. You can be my speech buddy. It also helps waking up students in the back of the room if they need it. Not that mine ever do. Or I'm sure none of you ever did. Anyway, today I'm talking about how to get the U.S. economy moving again. And I have a confession to make. The very first political campaign that I got involved in involved someone whose slogan was, "Let's get the economy moving again." There's maybe one or two of you who are actually old enough to remember who used that as a slogan. I was 16 years old when John Kennedy ran for office, and in my school uniform, I stood outside our house, which was strategically next to PS 63, where people voted, handing out Jack Kennedy literature. It was sort of my introduction to politics. Today, I think there's very much a need to get the U.S. economy moving again. And I've got a fairly simple talk. And knowing my luck with technology, I minimized the number of slides so that if they didn't work, I wouldn't worry. And okie dokie. Good. You won't miss much. And it's not your glasses. Anyway, first of all, the problem. I'm going to sketch the problem, although I think most of this audience is pretty well familiar with it. Then I'm going to propose a fairly radical program of reform that I think is needed. I limited myself to 5 broad things. I could have easily made it 10. And since this is a group that's heavily involved in politics, and since politics is the art of the possible, and since politics would be part of the solution, I do have something of a pessimistic note I'm ending on. I think the outlook for that sort of radical reform is grim. But who knows? Miracles happen. I won't deluge you with statistics and with graphs, although that's my favorite medium, showing graphs of economic time series and so on. I'll only show you one. We know that the unemployment rate nationally is going down. It's still fairly high by historical standards. It's amazingly high when you consider the fact this is the year 2014 and we're 5 years into an economic recovery. By this time, most post-war recessions have long since gotten a recovery that brought the unemployment rate down to around 4 or even 5%, and in many cases had already gone into the next recession. The Economist, the magazine out of London that's probably the most widely read in the world by leaders of companies and leaders of countries, in a recent issue said that this is the weakest recovery since World War II. According to my scorecard, it's the weakest in a century. And I even went back and after I read that, started checking my own analysis. The recovery from 37, 38 was certainly stronger than this recovery. The recovery from that started in March of 33 was stronger. Now, admittedly, those were much deeper holes to jump out of than the one we're in now, or that we were in 2009. And if you go back to the 20s, I really can't find anything comparable to this recovery, this one. In fact, some of you heard Amity Shlaes when she talked in Wichita. And she points out that probably the strongest economic recovery we've had in the last 100 years was the one we had under Harding and Coolidge. Neither one of whom usually get very favorable marks from economists. But I look at the data, not the press releases. When were the 20s? Right after World War I, we had a very severe recession and it bounced right back out. But policies were different. Anyway, the trouble with looking at the unemployment rate, which is the thing that grabs the headlines, is that first of all, there's something like 7.3 million men and women in the United States who are working part-time but actually want to work full-time. They're not working part-time out of choice, they're working part-time out of lack of opportunities from the economy. So if you hear the unemployment rate 6.1%, that's understating the size of the problem. And if you go one step further and look at the number of people who just simply stopped looking at all, have given up all hope, have retired early not because they wanted to retire early, but simply because they saw no prospects for ever finding another job, or have been unemployed so long that people look at their resume and throw them away. So in order to have a better look at the real job situation, I took the number of people who had jobs and I divided it by the work age population. So this is sort of more than the reverse of the unemployment rate. This is a number where better is good, higher is good, bigger is good, lower is bad. Unemployment rate, the higher is bad, lower is good. And you can't probably make out the dates there, but that peaked in 2006 in the current cycle. And you can see it went down and then started really going down fast in 2008. And then when we hit the recovery, officially the recovery started in the summer of 2009, June 2009, employment started going up, but the fact that that's a flat line for the most part basically means that the growth in employment in this recovery has been barely keeping pace with population. Now, the last couple of employment reports look pretty good. And there's some other indicators that maybe the recovery is starting becoming somewhat more robust. But 5 years of of barely keeping up with population growth, with GDP growth at about 2% a year, if that, is not exactly a typical recovery. And I say that again, looking at every business cycle for the last 100 years. I don't want to oversell the point. I guess if this were the Democratic equivalent of the Pachyderm Club, maybe I'd have a harder sell, but I think even there I would find a fairly sympathetic response to there may be differences in terms of how to approach the problem. At any rate, when I quoted Abraham Lincoln before, it occurred to me that the modern politician figures that I can get some of the people mad at me some of the time, and maybe even some of the people mad at me all the time. But they usually try to avoid having all the people mad at them all of the time. I guess I would make a lousy modern politician. Because by the time I'm done, I'll probably find something to get almost everybody here mad at me. But I think we need to start thinking differently. We need to start being willing to consider some real changes, which may be radical for one party or the other or both. Hopefully you all have full stomachs and didn't take any rotten tomatoes back, and I didn't see them on the menu, so I felt good. And again, don't worry about not seeing the PowerPoint slides. What should we do? First thing, I'd raise interest rates. That seems counter to everything economic textbooks tell you. But I'm going to go back to an economic textbook that was written even before I was born. Bagehot was an editor in the 1800s of The Economist, and he may have been the founding editor. And he wrote a book on central banking, which I think is still one of the best. Now, admittedly, it was a very different era. Britain was the leading economy in the world, and London was the leading financial market in the world, and the Bank of England was the central bank for the world. And actually, the Fed is the central bank for the world now, although we don't always think of it that way. And his prescription in a financial crisis was, one, lend to sound banks liberally, keep them afloat, and we did that. Not everybody agrees with the policy, but Ben Bernanke had learned one lesson from the Great Depression. Secondly, raise interest rates, and do both together. And the reason for that is to sort of bring the liquidity crisis to a head, drag out liquidity that's not being used, and try to shorten the financial crisis. And the last 3 recessions that we've had in the United States over the last 30 years are much more like the types of recessions that Bagehot faced in the 1800s in England than what most economists, including myself, were weaned on when we were studying U.S. economic history after World War II. Except, actually, for some of us, it wasn't necessarily history. Why do I say raise interest rates? Well, first of all, it's clear that the Fed's policies have not got the economy moving. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such a weak recovery. You can blame it on other types of policies. I'm willing to argue that. But it certainly can't say, well, look, they've kept interest rates around 0 and see the huge growth in the economy that's come from it. What's it Jesus says about, from their fruits you shall know them? And I think there's some very good reasons why these low interest rates have not created employment growth. First of all, one of the biggest areas where we've seen losses in employment that's somewhat unusual for a recession is in state and local government. Now, more in some states than others. And you might say, well, gee, what's the connection with interest rates? Well, one of the largest sectors of the economy that still has defined benefit pension plans, a pension plan where the employer guarantees a certain income over time and therefore has to invest funds in order to produce a return in order to do that, is state and local governments, and to some extent the federal government, although under Reagan that was partly changed. Well, state of Kansas has tried to grapple with the fact that its pension liabilities are so large and try to fund it to an extent that states like California and New York have not. We've already seen certain cities go bankrupt. We've seen credit downgradings in municipalities. We've seen the Detroit bankruptcy, which is one of the more spectacular ones. And part of that is kind of principles of finance. If you're running a pension fund and you've got defined benefits in the future, you know what those future cash flows are. That's a liability. That's something you owe. Well, what I teach my students is if I've got a stream of things in the future that I owe, I should calculate the present value. So the size of that liability is dependent on two things: what the stream of benefits are and what the discount rate is, how much I'm discounting those future dollars. The lower the interest rate and the lower the returns on investment portfolios, the bigger that liability is. Either take my word for it or take out a piece of paper and do a little calculation. If I owe $1,000 a year from now, what's the present value of that? Well, it's a lot more if I'm discounting at 2% than at 10%. About 8% more, I think. All right, so one of the reasons why you've seen such a decline in employment in state and local government for the country as a whole, and it varies from state to state and place to place, is because the states themselves in some cases try to come to grips with the fact that they have actually a pretty lousy balance sheet in their pension liabilities. If you take the part of the private economy that also has defined benefit plans, they're exactly in the same soup. This has certainly been one of the areas where you've seen a lot of weakness. The lower the interest rates, the bigger corporate liabilities, and the more expensive it is to hire a new employer. The arithmetic's pretty straightforward. The incentives are terrible. The third thing, and the third reason why I say raise interest rates, is that I've become convinced as I study the data and look at the experience of the last 30 years, is that instead of giving an incentive for real businesses to create real investment that creates new jobs, what low interest rates do is they give investment bankers an incentive to create new securities. Basically, short-term interest rates are the cost of their raw materials. And let's face it, if I'm going to tie up funds, do I want to tie it up in a plan over 12 or 15 years, or do I want to tie it up in a set of securities I can sell in a hurry in liquid markets? I can produce the same return on equity with leverage that I can produce by investing in real physical assets that create jobs, plants, equipment, and the like. And this is made worse by the fact that the past rounds of low interest rates that we've had, and more importantly, the growth in credit that we had during those periods of low interest rates, partly because of the investment bankers producing securities, has resulted in a lot of overbuilding in lots of areas. I looked at the data that the Bureau of Economic Analysis puts out on the GDP. And they have a category of investment spending called investment in structures. When a business builds a building, whether it's in a shopping center, a factory, any kind of structure that a business buys, it's a type of investment. Typically, that peaks a little bit after the economy peaks, hits bottom a little after the economy hits bottom, recovers in the recovery, and then gets to a higher level than it was before the recession started. If you look at the earlier post-World War II recessions. Here we are 5 years after the bottom of the recession, and we still have not seen business investment in structures recover to the level that it was in 2006 and 2007. I think it actually even peaked a little bit later than that. Tends to be a lagging indicator. Not only that, it hasn't gotten back to the level it was before the recession of 2001. To me, that's pretty clear evidence that too much was built during those expansions, fueled by a great deal of credit. I've plotted the growth of financial assets relative to the growth of physical assets. And starting around 1985, you see a dramatic change where financial assets grow so much faster than physical assets. Actual houses, apartment buildings, plants, equipment, and the like. How do I react to that? I think if you look at the first 8 post-war recessions, the Austrians were wrong. If you look at the last 3, maybe the Austrians can't be wrong all the time. Maybe there was malinvestment, and that's holding back the economy. I found the exact same phenomenon in Japan. That's probably not a tough sell in this audience, but some of the other things will be. What to do? All right, second thing. I would replace the largest deduction in the tax code, the interest deduction on residences, with a flat housing deduction. And I'm thinking you take the average house in the United States, not in Wichita, but you know, it was probably the average house in Wichita, old ones, big ones, little ones, it's probably a little over 100,000. Nationally, it's maybe even closer to 200,000. I take a number, a large number, and give everybody the same deduction. Now, why would I want to do that? First of all, I think the residential interest rate deduction, that's a mouthful, isn't it? The residential interest rate deduction is an unindicted co-conspirator in the last financial crisis. We basically were giving people a tax incentive to borrow too much money. We didn't see it that way. We see it as the means of financing the American dream. But it certainly financed an increase in house prices that caused all kinds of trouble. It looked like a great idea on the way up. And I'm sure this is one of the most sacred cows in this room. But it's also an issue of fairness. I know a lot of people are talking about attacking the 1% and so on. And some members of the 1%, like Steyer and Soros, are financing that campaign, curiously, and Warren Buffett. However, think about it. If an NBA player goes out and buys a $36 million house, and if Robert here, one of my students at Friends, goes out and struggles and scrimps and buys a $60,000 house in Wichita, and they both have a 20% down payment, the NBA player gets, if I did my arithmetic right, 6,000 times the deduction that Robert gets. But it seems to me I want to help Robert more than that NBA player. I suppose I shouldn't come into a audience of Republicans and say we should be helping the little guy instead of the big guy, but I think that's what Reagan did.
Well, then on that same line of thinking, the property tax ought to be the same for every house, instead of based upon the valuation of the house.
You mean in the federal income tax?
I'm talking about our property tax that we pay to city and county. Our valuation that they tax
All right. All right, here, and by the way, here I'm purely talking about the federal income tax. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting incentives in the federal income tax. If I'm in New York and I'm charging twice the income tax or 3 times the income tax rate that I am in Kansas, I get a much bigger deduction for my local property tax. I mean, for my all my local taxes. When I was living in New York City, I had 3 income taxes. Joy. I was rich with taxes. But at the same time, those tax rates are high, but it gives great incentives for people to give tax breaks to someone that they like. I'm sure that's all for altruistic reasons. See what else I can get people mad at me with. I would, this is particularly radical. The advantage of being an academic is that you can propose things that even if you know that if I were a politician, I'd have no chance of getting them passed. But I would want to replace both the corporate income tax and the Social Security payroll taxes with a value-added tax. A value-added tax treats everybody the same. I don't care whether you're a master limited partnership or someone who's got his own business, maybe a Dairy Queen, or I'm a large corporation. If I'm a pipeline company, I set up myself as a master limited partnership, I don't pay corporate income taxes. On the other hand, if Apple does all its operations in the United States, they pay 35% as an income tax, which now is actually the highest of any major country in the world. It wasn't always that way, but even Japan's is less than ours now. Japan starting to scratch its head and say, well, after 20 years of no growth, maybe we should do something differently. Well, it might have had a 0.5% growth a year. Why? I think the incentives would be a lot better, and it would also greatly reduce the type of rent seeking that the income tax structure creates now. Why do you want to if you're a politician, if you're a member of Congress, especially if you're head of the Ways and Means Committee or the Senate equivalent? Why would you want a high corporate income tax? Well, then you could have all sorts of corporations constantly lobbying you for some sort of tax break. It's what economists call rent seeking. And then if you want to go the tax system, you simply say that the average tax is so much less, the effective tax rate. The effective tax rate is because you're averaging someone who's getting a deal and someone who's not. But the marginal rate that gives it incentives to business, when I teach my students at Friends, you're going to decide to buy a piece of equipment or build a factory, you got to take the tax rate into account. The higher the tax rate, ultimately the higher before tax return you need to make that investment work. Again, I think in spreadsheets. John, are you keeping track of the time? Oh, good. Sure. I'll whip this around. I would roll back a lot of the regulations. Let's see, who's here? I remembered impassioned speech in front of this group from someone who says about how much harder it is to start a business now than it was 20 years ago. And I changed the Affordable Care Act to have a lot more market-based incentives. And in fact, personally, I think the fact that in the United States 17% of our GDP goes to healthcare is largely based on the fact that we got so many things in between what a person who's going to a doctor or a hospital pays and what ultimately is spent on that. You know, World War II, we decided that having health insurance as a tax deduction for companies gave a great incentive to get around price controls, but the long run effect has been amazing. In Japan, you can go get an MRA walking off the street for $30. In the United States, by the time your insurance company gets finished paid for it, I would probably have a heart attack when I saw the bill. And I sometimes look at those bills. It's what's paid, not what I pay, that's going to determine how expensive our system is. Finally, I'll really get you mad. I know I've got to have a couple of people mad at me for this. I look at our immigration laws, and I look at them historically. In the 1800s, the United States made the most amazing surge forward. And it was a time when we had enormous immigration. I looked at the numbers for the first decade of the 1900s, so just over 100 years ago. And the number of new immigrants coming into the country as a percent of the total population was 9%. Well, we have about 300 and some million people now. 330. 330. 9 times 330 would be about 30 million. The equivalent number is if over the next 10 years we had 30 million immigrants come into the country. I also went and I plotted productivity in the United States economy versus the percent of the economy that was either foreign-born or the offspring of foreign-born. And it's just amazing. The two lines go in opposite directions. This is over 100 years. Now, I know correlation's not causation, but when I think about things like the fact that 16% of the Fortune 500, 16% of those companies was founded or co-founded by an immigrant. 40% were founded by either an immigrant or the offspring of an immigrant. When the United States decided to rebel against Great Britain, I'm in the middle of reading Edmund Burke's biography, and right now he's telling Pitt how stupid his policies are in the U.S. One of the big things that the U.S. needed was money. Well, the people who raised the finance for the American Revolution, and the people who set up the financial system afterwards, that ultimately led the economy to being the first one in the Western world to take off economically, were 3 immigrants. Our first Secretary of State, the head of finance for the Continental Congress, and the president of the first bank of the United States. I suppose if we had the same immigration laws we have now, then... Gallatin. Lafayette I thought was just a soldier. He might have helped finance us too. He probably lobbied some with the king. Yeah. We should be grateful to him. I thought of him every time I used to get off the Lafayette's subway station in New York. Today, according to the Kaufman Institute, this isn't a government agency. This is our foundation on entrepreneurship right here in Kansas City, says that has dug through the numbers and found today immigrants are twice as likely to start a new business than people who were born here. There's a dynamism that we've been losing ever since we started passing restrictive immigration laws. First one was 1884, 86, when we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Then in 1920 and 1923, we passed the 2 immigration laws that dramatically restricted who could come here. And perhaps I'm taking this personally. Who were the immigrants that had come the 20 years before those laws were passed? In the last decade of the 1800s, first decade of the 1900s. There are people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. There were Catholics and Orthodox and Jews, people like my grandfather. That law was essentially geared to keeping them out of the country. And if you look, within a decade we had a Great Depression. I'm not saying cause and effect, but certainly didn't help any. And if you look at our productivity over the last century, it's been declining steadily. And I think part of it is the loss of vitality that we had from not having basically pretty open borders back in the 1800s. How many people here have read Death Comes to the Archbishop by Willa Cather? I think it was a big read one year. Anyway, I think I must have read it because I wanted to find out something about the Southwest as I come from the coast. When he was made Archbishop, Lamy, when he was made Archbishop of Santa Fe, the United States had just won the Mexican-American War, and now all that was part of the United States. He had to go to Galveston, take a ship to Monterey, get on a burro, go through Mexico, then come up the Rio Grande Valley. And then when he got there, they refused to hand over the cathedral until he went and talked to got a letter from the bishop back in Mexico. So then he goes down the Rio Grande, goes across into Mexico. Nobody ever stopped him. Nobody ever asked him for his papers. In fact, most of the time he hadn't a clue where the border was. You know, I think we have a very romantic idea of how some of our ancestors got here. They sent a few people back at Ellis Island, where most of my family came through, but it was usually because they were sick or something, or there was some real, it was not because of where they came from or the fact that we had quotas on immigrants. So, from a purely economic point of view, I think we need some dramatically different immigration laws. And, you know, it's if we go and we say, well, it's the law, I remember that Dred Scott was the law in 1854. And we were certainly right to hang John Brown. But I think history's been kinder to John Brown than to the person who enforced the law. You know, 100 years from now, or 50 years from now, or even 20 years from now, we may look at the things that get us really mad right now very differently. And if we, anybody here a fan of James Madison? I know he's from Virginia, but you know, he's still a good guy. Good Presbyterian, by the way. He cited Pennsylvania as a state in order to emulate, because he said in Pennsylvania they encourage everybody to come here, and they have a law of toleration because religion was certainly the most divisive issue at the time. And whereas Maryland was the first state to have a law of toleration, which was promptly snuffed out by a bunch of Virginians, Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers, not the Catholics like Maryland, was allowed anybody in and encouraged religious toleration, and it wound up being the most prosperous and the most populous of the 13 colonies. And James Madison held that up as an example to the rest of the country when they were debating the laws in Virginia.